Welcome to the T2 Hubcast. Join Martin, Dave, Spencer and guests as they discuss all things personal and professional development. The T2 Hubcast, brought to you by the People Performance People.
So welcome to another T2 Hubcast with me, Martin Johnson.
And me, Spencer Locker.
Absolutely, right, absolutely. So we're jumping back on today. We're going to talk about something which is related to hiring great talent. Mm-hmm. As the Hub members will know, we have a lot of pathways and content on hiring great talent. But for this particular Hubcast, Spence, we wanted to focus on the interview process, but more specifically, the types of questions you can ask in an interview.
Yeah.
And we're going to break this down into the three types of questions, the three different kinds of questions you can ask in an interview.
Yeah.
Of course, you can ask many questions within all these three areas.
Yeah.
But there are three different types or kinds of interview that we can ask.
Yeah.
And in our training, we teach this to the delegates in our training courses.
Yeah.
But we thought it would make a really good, snappy, short Hubcast. And hopefully the listeners will be able to go away and think about the types of questions they're asking in the process at the minute.
Yeah, and I think that it's quite relevant because in our recent experience, we're talking to, I think it was a group of HR execs where they were just sort of throwing the boat about a bit and tossing things in randomly. And we heard about some questions that were asked that were, shall we say, inappropriate?
Just a little. I mean, I guess what Spencer's talking about there, just for people listening, is we had an example from a senior HR exec where they said their managers have never received any training on interviewing. So it's sort of like they're left to their own devices. And that means every manager will do their own thing. Usually it ends up as a generalist conversation and you just sort of seeing where it goes. But one of the questions that were raised was a male hiring manager had asked a younger female candidate in the interview. They asked them the question, which was this. So then, do you have any plans to have children? Yeah, right. I know, right? But that is what happens. It's an unconscious thing. But really, that is an inappropriate question to ask a young female candidate. I mean, does it really matter in the modern day world? But what essentially that manager was probably trying to find out is, am I going to lose you to maternity leave in the next few years? Because that's I have to consider that. So we've just got to educate our managers on a few do's and don'ts, and if they prepare accordingly, they can start to predefine some of the questions they're going to ask in the interview, which are situationally relevant, and they're going to test for a great candidate.
Yeah, and I think it's also relevant to state that when we start talking about the structure of an interview, we've put a lot of thought and effort and work into structuring an interview, and as much as we've come up with these three types of questions, it's still quite loose. It's not too restrictive. More guidelines. You can populate these types of questions however you see fit. It's got to be relevant to the role that you're interviewing with, relevant to the company, but it's not too restrictive.
Yes. So it's not a sort of, it's not a script you've got to follow.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to give you the three types of questions you can ask. We're going to share with you some examples of the questions you can ask within the three types.
Yeah.
But like Spencer says, feel free to go away and create some of your own questions within these categories and just make sure that you're asking a blend of the three. I think that's what the point we're going to make today.
Yeah.
So let's kick off. So the first type of question that managers can ask in an interview is what we call a conceptual-based question. Now, a conceptual-based question is when we're asking the candidate, or we're giving the candidate, should I say, a scenario, situation, or event, and we're asking them, how would you deal with that?
Yeah.
So we're leaving it entirely up to creativity.
Yeah.
We're giving you a concept and we're going to ask you, you're free to go anywhere you like with it, but we're going to ask you how you would deal with that.
Yeah. And
this is called a conceptual based question because you're giving them a concept and they can answer how they please. They can make it up. They can be creative, etc. And what you're saying is, look, this is the scenario. You're presented with it. How would you deal with that?
Yeah.
And a lot of interviewers will naturally ask conceptual-based questions about the role or about the future or about certain things they might encounter.
Certainly.
Go on,
I was just gonna say the again with the when you start talking about any of these questions, they're quite open questions. Yes, you might create a concept, and you might be checking for this particular individual to sort of say this is what I would do. But when you get that answer, then it opens up a whole raft of other opportunities. Why did you answer that way? Why is that? Why? So you can sort of get more beneath the skin, if you like, a bit deeper into that person's thought process.
Yeah. So conceptual based questions. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. You've got a candidate in, and this is a type of conceptual based question you can ask.
Yeah.
It's your first few weeks in the role. A customer rings up and immediately becomes aggressive with you. You don't have enough knowledge yet to field the complaint. How would you respond? How would you respond? Yeah. It's a conceptual based question. I am giving you a scenario that you're likely to encounter in the role, and I want to test up front how at this moment you think you would deal with that.
Yeah. That's
a conceptual based question. Another example might be if you're hiring a manager or a team leader in from external who have to inherit a team. You know, you take on the new team as a manager. In the early days of your tenure, a senior and long-standing member of the team challenges you about your level of experience in front of the group. How would you respond?
Oh, yeah.
We've seen it happen time and time again, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the challenges of a new manager or an external manager coming in. But that's a conceptual-based question that you could hit that potential candidate with, right? Final one from me on this. You're 2 weeks into your new role. It turns out that it's not entirely what you had expected. You start to have doubts about your ability to succeed. What would you do? Or what do you do? And this is I always talk about it, that Spence. When you take on a new role, you go through the process. It's like the slope of enlightenment, right? You're excited, the emotion's high, the idea is hot.
Yeah.
You take the role, you're a week or so in, right? You reach the peak of expectations at the top of the cycle.
Yeah.
And then third or fourth week in, the reality of the job starts to set in and you're in the trough of disillusionment.
Yeah.
And we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
And this is a great conceptual based question for any candidate in any role to ask them that, you're 2 weeks in. It turns out, you believe you've been sold down the river. It's not exactly what you thought. How do you respond?
Yeah.
Because I want to test how you respond in that situation. And that is another example of a conceptual-based question.
Yeah, and a good one. Good one.
So to clarify, a conceptual-based question is where you ask the candidate or you give the candidate a scenario or event or a situation and you ask how they would deal with it.
Yes.
It leaves them to be creative, free, to think on the spot, to come up with anything they want. Yeah, it's a conceptual-based question. It tests for creativity. Right, second type of question, behavioural-based question, Spence.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Well, when you start thinking about behavioural-based and comparing it to the conceptual-based, whereas the language you use with the conceptual question is more that how would you? With the behavioural one, it's more how did you? So give me an example. Have you? Is this a situation you've been in? How did you deal with it? So they're accessing a different part of the brain. So rather than being creative, they're accessing the different part of the brain where they're actually recalling a moment.
Yes. Really important point Spencer's just made there. A behavioural-based question just switches it on its head. We're saying, okay, this is how you've just said you would deal with it. Give me an example of when you've encountered that in a previous role and tell me how you actually dealt with it.
Yeah.
And sometimes a behavioural-based question is a great follow-up to a conceptual one.
Certainly,
so give them the conceptual-based question first. How would you deal with this? And then instantly hit them with okay, have you ever encountered this in a previous role? And if so, tell me how you actually dealt with it. So you're actually testing now for experience. Yes, you can be creative and you think on your feet, but do you have any experience in actually dealing with this? You made a great point in another talk we did recently, Spence, where you said, be prepared to ask a conceptual-based question and get a behavioural-based answer.
Certainly, yeah. When we start looking at that, I suppose it's linked a little bit to the openness of the candidate and the rapport that you've actually developed. So it might be a case of you ask a conceptual-based question and they come back saying, well, you know what, I've actually experienced something like that in the past. and then come forward with how they dealt with it. And then that can lead on to other things. It might be a case of, this is how I dealt with it, but you know what? At that time, I was a little bit of inexperienced. So if this was to happen again, I might approach in a different manner. And then, and it's the rapport, it's the how they feel at the time. Are they willing to engage? Are they willing to volunteer information? Are you able to elicit that information from them? So
behavioural-based questions, a couple more examples from me, just slightly different take on the language when you ask them. So if I look at the first 3 questions we did on conceptual, and I give you a slight twist to make it a behavioural one. So here's an example. Give me an example of when you have experienced an aggressive customer and talk me through how you actually dealt with it.
Yeah.
So we're now saying we want to test for experience. Different part of the brain, as you say, the search for memories. It's not as easy for them to to waffle. No, they've got to search for a memory and try and connect the dots. Second behavioural-based question example. Can you recall a time where you have been challenged, opposed, or undermined in front of others, and share with me how you responded? Yeah. So again, you're now saying, listen, I know you can be creative and you've given me some great answers conceptually. Yeah. But have you actually ever faced these situations? And thirdly, have you ever fell out of your depth in a role? And if so, what did you do to overcome it? Great behavioral-based questions, because we've all felt like that at times. We all hit the trough of disillusionment early on in our new roles. It happens, right? We've become overwhelmed, feel out of depth. What did you do to overcome it? Because I want to test with this behavioral-based question that 3 weeks into your role with us, you're going to have some challenges. I need to know you've got the resilience and the experience to get through that.
Certainly, yeah.
And not just jump ship. So before we come to the last one, which is our favourite, let me just recap. We've got 3 types of questions we can ask in an interview. We've covered 2. Number 1, conceptual-based questions. Give them a scenario, situation, or event and ask them how they would deal with it. Yeah. It has to be relevant to the role. Has to be relevant to what they're going to come into. Yeah. Then switch it or back a conceptual with a behavioural. Give me an example of when you've actually experienced this or gone through this, and how did you deal with it? Yeah. And we're just testing a different part of the brain to say, do you have any real life experience in dealing with these situations?
And it's important to understand as an interviewer that it's not a case of you ask a certain amount of conceptual questions and then a certain amount of behavioural questions. You mix them up, don't you?
Yeah. It's got to be natural. Yeah. You've got to, because if you just stick in conceptual, you might have a great interviewee, but they might not be a good candidate. We've all seen those hires before who have blitzed the interview. 3 months in, they're not what you think, and you sort of turn into your colleague saying, well, they was absolutely brilliant in the interview, right? It's because you probably asked them lots of conceptual questions and they nailed it, because a great, socially excellent, charismatic person can easily field conceptual questions because you're giving them the creativity to go anywhere and say anything. So by mixing it with behavioural, to your point, it doesn't have to be an equal measure, but you've got to mix some of them in to say, okay, I want to test to see if you can back up what you've just said with any experience. Okay, third question. The third type of question you can ask in an interview. So if conceptual and behavioural are going to be around the role and the organisation, the individual, and the third questions are going to be something from left field. Yeah. And these are called anxiety questions. Now, anxiety questions are designed to throw 1 or 2 of these in the interview process. You can't bombard them with anxiety questions, but you can get away with 1 or 2 well-placed anxiety questions, which are going to put them under a little bit of pressure, and they're going to really test their mettle and their clock speed, their ability to think on their feet. It's also going to test their resilience.
Certainly, yeah.
So anxiety questions are where you ask them a very left field, very strange at times, completely out of the blue question to see A, how they react, B, can they process why you're asking them this question, and C, can they respond with in some fashion under pressure.
And I think that, again, with the anxiety questions, they can come from left field. They can, and these left field unpredictable questions work wonders. But you can also ask them these ones that aren't too left field. The things that maybe about the previous job, about sort of looking at the morals really, and looking at the what they're prepared to say. it puts people under pressure because people don't know what to say. What will they say, or whatever they say may speak volumes about them that they aren't particularly proud of.
Yeah, and the uncertainty of the question is running through their mind instantly. Oh my God, what's the right thing to say? What's the wrong thing to say? Why are they asking me this? Are they testing me? Do I make a joke of it? Am I supposed to be serious?
Yes.
Is there a right answer? Is there a wrong answer? So they're very, very good for creating enough controlled anxiety in the candidate, so it makes it tough for them. But without absolutely, sending them into a complete meltdown. And that's the key, I think. It's got to be timely, it's got to be relevant, and it can only be one or two throughout.
Yeah.
So let's give some examples of anxiety questions. I'll kick off first, one of my favorites. So I'm interviewing, I'm mixing between conceptual and behavioral. We're talking about the role, we're talking about their experience, their past, and all the rest of it. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, I hit them with an anxiety question.
Yeah.
And it is completely out of the blue. And I hit them with this. You're stranded on a desert island. You can choose 3 items only, but you can't choose anything with power or any type of boat, ship, or vessel. What would you choose and why? Now, you can imagine you're breezing the interview. You're getting a lot of situational questions, conceptual and behavioural.
Yeah.
You're talking about the role. You're talking about your career. You're in your comfort zone, and bang, this lands on you.
Yeah.
And I'm not really too bothered about the answer, but I am looking to how you process that information and respond.
Yeah.
And for example, with this particular question, there's 3 types of answers, 3 buckets. You either get the practical thinker who goes, okay, I'm stranded on the island. I need to survive. So they'll come up with something like, fishing rod, water purifiers, and a knife.
Yeah.
And you think, practical person, right? They've processed that. They've gone straight into a mode of survival, and quite a good answer. Or you'll get the second bucket of people who go, no, I'm a risk taker and I want to be creative. I want to get off the island.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go high risk but high reward. So I'm gonna go length of rope, some materials to build a boat, and a flare gun.
Yeah.
And you can see the way their brain's working, right?
Yeah,
But still, more creative, more risk taking, but a good answer. And then you get the third group of people who sort of in a fluster or under pressure sort of think, well, I'll make a joke of this.
Yeah.
Right. So they go for the old, well, I'm stranded and I'm doomed anyway, so I might as well go out in style.
Yeah.
So I'll have a supermodel, a barbecue, and some beers.
Yeah.
Right. And you always have the 3 types of response to that: the practical response, the creative response, or the jovial social response.
Yeah.
But the point is, it's an anxiety question because it comes from nowhere. We just want to see how they think on their feet.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Go on, Spence. Give me an example of an anxiety question you like.
One thing I like is if you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Great question.
And when they answer that, then it might be within the answer an explanation of why. But if not, if it's just a straightforward closed answer, a statement, then you can. Yeah. Why is that then? Why is that? What advantages do you think that's going to give?
And that's a conversation we've all had down the pub or down mates over a beer, right?
Yeah.
But what superpower would I want? I might answer that right here and now. I've always toyed between the ability to fly, or be invisible.
Yeah.
And I've always sort of edged on the side of being invisible because you could get away with anything.
Oh, yeah.
And you could go and spy on people. And I could go and spy on my kids at school, and I could come into the office and see what you lot say about me. But
says a lot about you, Martin.
And you always say, don't you? Your superpower is supposed to be to do good for the planet.
Yeah.
No, manipulation, complete manipulation.
Yeah.
So, great anxiety question. And again, the answer's irrelevant, but how do you respond to it?
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple of anxiety questions from me for the listeners who are thinking how they can deploy this. How would you explain an atom to a child? That's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
How would you explain an atom to a child? And most people I've ever asked that question to just go into meltdown. They stutter, they've got no clue, they can't answer it, etc. But I did have one guy who absolutely nailed it, and I'll never forget him. He instantly started talking out loud, and he said, atom to a child, and he's mumbling like this. And he says, well, it would have to be something a child could understand. What do children understand? Toys. So which toys are large things made up a lot of smaller things? A Rubik's Cube. and this is how he's talking, and I'm sort of in amazement. He says a Rubik's Cube. So he says, what I'd do is I'd get a Rubik's Cube, or I'd explain the Rubik's Cube, and I'd say to the child, everything in life is a large thing made up of lots of little things, and the little things are atoms. So in the Rubik's Cube, it's a square made up of lots of smaller squares. So the small squares represent the atoms.
Yeah.
And I was just like, when can you start? When do you want the job? It was a fantastic answer. But again, we're looking for how they respond under pressure. Another one for me, why do they make manhole covers round?
Yeah.
When you really think about it, there's lots of reasons, from being able to roll it to the side if you take it off, for human beings to fit down it. Structurally, it's more sound than a square hole. But it's easier said than done when it's in the moment, right?
Yeah.
And the last one for me, before I get a few more from you, Spence, is name 20 uses for a blanket other than sleeping or keeping warm.
I like that.
I mean, there's a million uses for a blanket, but when you're on the spot, it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, that'll be a difficult one. Again, you could probably, because you specified 20, somebody will automatically link onto that. Well, I've got to come up with 20, and everybody could probably come up with 5 or 6, but that 20, that figure will mean something to somebody, and they'll start putting themselves under pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, that's why we call it an anxiety question.
So go on, give me a couple more of yours.
Oh, if you won £1 million on the lottery, what would you do with the money?
Yeah, that's a good pub question as well, isn't it? Yeah. With your mates down the pub.
Yeah.
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Why not? Why not?
£1 million. Well, my answer's probably not going to be the standard. I probably would do something with it that most other people wouldn't.
Yeah.
But I guess in the right here and now, I would probably take the majority of that money and I would invest it in the cause, in T2, in us. Because we're on a mission to change a lot of workplaces and change a lot of lives and educate a lot of leaders and inspire the next generation coming through the workplace. Yeah. And it means something to me. Now, what £750,000 would do would be, we're doing very well at T2, but that would allow us to fast track our progress. Yeah. We could really launch some of the products and services and build some of the products and services we want to do. We could penetrate more markets. We could get our message out there. And I would hope then that my rewards would come further down the line. So I would probably do that and leave a little bit left over for holidays and memories with the family, because I don't need anything materialistic in my life. I'm happy. Now, my wife, if she heard me say this, would probably interject and say, we're not spending any money on the business. Thank you very much. I'll take control of that. But that's probably what I would do.
Yeah.
What would you do, Spence?
I would probably split it in two. Take £500,000. I'd seriously invest it in sex and beer and rock and roll. And the other £500, I'd just fritter away.
Absolutely. And if any listeners are listening, great advice from T2 consultant Spencer Locker on how to spend £1 million. But yeah, the point is what that question would do in an interview, bringing it back to a more serious point, is it would give you an idea of the candidate's values, interests, hobbies, passions.
Yeah, certainly.
And that sometimes is really important. It's a really good indicator of the type of person you are recruiting.
Yeah.
So another great anxiety question. Go on, give me one more.
We've got one I quite like, is not that left field. What did you least like about your previous job?
Yeah.
Because, again, it's putting that person on the spot and they're sat there thinking, well, if I say something negative, what will that say about me? What will that say about the last company? What if something similar is happening in the company that I'm trying to get a job with?
Yeah. What if I say something that I didn't like about the previous company, which the hiring manager knows is present in the current company, and therefore it goes against me. How honest do I be? Do they want me to be honest? Right. So it is. That's going to create a level of anxiety, but it's a situational anxiety question, because the manager wants to know what their frustrations are, and what they're likely going to need support with, or coaching on in the new role. So some great anxiety questions there. On the T2 Hub, for any listeners, if you go to the pathway section under hiring great talent, we've got a pathway on there with some more questions in each of these categories. So feel free to go and have a look and give yourself some ideas. But just to wrap this up, Spence, and just sort of summarize what we've talked about, there are 3 main types of questions that you can ask in an interview. Conceptual-based questions are where you give the candidate a scenario, situation, or event and ask them how they would deal with it.
Yeah.
It engages a part of the brain for creativity. There's no rules with this. They can make it up, but you're just seeing where they can go with this and how they're thinking already about how they can encounter certain situations they're going to face when they get into the role. The second type of question is a behavioral based question. And it's just a play on words. It's a slight shift in language and positioning, but it's where you then go, okay, give me an example of where you've experienced this in a previous organization and how did you deal with it?
Yeah.
So the phrasing you use, can you recall a time when? Have you ever felt? So you're now searching a different part of the brain, i.e. the parietal lobe where memories are stored.
Yeah.
And it's not as easy for people to blag when you're switching between these questions, right? Yeah. You can see it in body language and in the way they respond. So a combination of conceptual and behavioral around the job, the role, their past, their skills, is a really great way to interview. Don't sit in one column, conceptual or behavioral, mix the two.
Yeah.
The third and final question you can ask are anxiety questions.
Yeah.
And we give you plenty of examples. Some are silly, some are challenging, some are relevant. But at the end of the day, you can afford to put one or two well-placed anxiety questions into the interview. Only one or two. But if you don't want to make it too easy for them by sitting in conceptual and behavioural.
No.
We want to separate from a great interviewee and a fantastic candidate. And you know what? The research shows that some of the most famous brands and successful organizations out there deploy anxiety questions.
Yeah.
Google, Apple, McKinsey, Gartner, right? Voted by Glassdoor the top organizations in the world to work for, right? Amazon. These organizations, these managers ask anxiety questions because they want to test people's credentials under pressure. Because in most roles, we're faced with a little bit of pressure or something. And I think we're about on time for this Hubcast. I think that concludes what we're talking about, Spence. Right. Would you add anything on this?
No. I just think that again, there's from my own speciality, from my own particular experience, it's the brain chemicals. It's messing with the brain chemicals because there's certain situations that people who are creative are going to be comfortable in.
Yeah.
But when you come to behavioural, that's going to challenge them a little bit, get that brain chemical going, and then you hit them straight away with a conceptual question again. Oh, back in the comfort zone, and then another behavioural one. Oh, a bit challenging, and then we get an anxiety question. So it's taking them out of the comfort zone. But again, it's not an interrogation. It is an interview. But as you said, do you want a good interviewee or do you want a magnificent candidate? And this is the way that you're going to make sure that you get what you want. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's advice coming from Spencer Locker, who's is a resistance to interrogation instructor, ex-military, working with the Special Forces, and also on the show SES Who Dares Win. So nobody knows about the importance of mixing your questioning and to really put somebody under pressure. Now, you made a good point, and this is to finish. It's not about interrogating them. It's not about blasting their confidence out the water. They're already nervous. But it's also not about making them sit in their comfort zone. If you want a great candidate, you've got to find the middle ground. To find the middle ground, you've got to combine conceptual, behavioural with a few well-placed anxiety questions.
Great stuff.
Awesome. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And we'll be back shortly for another Hubcast. Hopefully on something around hiring great talent, maybe leadership, maybe mindset. Who knows? We don't really plan it. So we'll see you soon. Thank you, Spencer.
Cheers. Thanks, Martin.